Let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for our April 2022 breakfast. My name is Karen King. I am the Community Affairs Liaison for the Office of New Haven Affairs at Yale University. Our office hosts these breakfasts on every month. It's usually the first Thursday of the month. We changed it for the special occasion to today. I will, at the end of the meeting, actually at the end of my remarks, I will share a link for you to sign up for the Office of New Haven Affairs newsletter so that you can get up-to-date links for every one of our events. And so you can stay on top of any potential date changes. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. I have a few announcements before we get started. The first is the Wyndham Campbell Prizes recently announced their latest slate of awardees. These are writers who are given an unrestricted $165,000 prize so that they can continue to do the great work that they are doing. This year's slate is on the website, as I said, is recently announced. In September, there will be a whole host of activities, lectures, opportunities for you to talk with and meet these wonderful writers. I'm going to put this link in the chat so that you can learn more and then sign up for updates about the event. Our office hosts the Yale Pathways program. The Yale Pathways to Science program in particular encourages young students in the New Haven Public Schools to explore different pathways to science through education, and also it exposes them to the many career choices that are available in the STEM fields. So there are wonderful opportunities every other Tuesday for young students to virtually meet at this point Yale scientists, so that these scientists can talk about their pathways and answer any questions that students may have. So this series is called Exploring Science. It's hosted virtually. It's held every other Tuesday at 6 p.m. You do have to register in advance, but I encourage you to share this information with any families who have students in grades 6 through 10. I also encourage all of you wonderful attendees, to regularly check out the Yale calendar. There are wonderful opportunities for you to engage with, learn from, listen to wonderful guest featured speakers and performers. One of the performances coming up, which I thought was delightful, is Hawk Henry's. This is going to be a webinar. Hawk Henry's, as they note, utilizes music and storytelling with a note of humor to weave a calm, engaging, and thought-provoking experience. This event will be taking place on April 14th at 12:30. I will drop the registration link in the chat. I also want to remind you all that the Yale Center for British Art and the Yale University Art Gallery are now open to the public. There are policies or requirements for updated vaccination information upon entrance. I will drop the links to the Yale Center for British Art and the Yale University Art Gallery in the chat so that you can look up the particular hours and the requirements. But we encourage you to visit as the world starts to open back up. Now, on to our wonderful speaker this morning. Professor Marci Shore teaches modern European intellectual history. Her research focuses on the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She is the translator of Mikhail Levinsky's Holocaust memoir, The Black Seasons, and the author of several books, including Caviar and Ashes, a Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, an Intimate History of Revolution. Marci has penned numerous articles as well. In 2018, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship for her current book project, A History of Phenomenology in East Central Europe, tentatively titled Eyeglasses Floating in Space, Central European Encounters That Came About While Searching for Truth. Professor Shore received her master's from the University of Toronto and her PhD from Stanford University. Please help me welcome Professor Marci Shore. Welcome, Marci.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, Well, it's lovely to be here. I wish I were here in happier circumstances. Um, but yes, under the circumstances, I'm happy to have a chance to talk to you all. Um, I thought I thought I would give you all a kind of, just a brief history of what is happening, because I know that I'm a Slavicist. My whole life is wrapped up in Eastern Europe and in this part of the world. And so there are lots of things that are intuitive to me that I wouldn't expect to be intuitive to anyone else. I mean, I know when horrible things happen in other parts of the world, I generally don't know what's going on with any kind of detail or intimacy. And there are tragedies going on around the world every day. I'm extremely wrapped up in and very emotional about this one because, this is a place I know well, and I have friends and colleagues there, and, they are now hiding in bomb shelters and fighting and being shot at. So it's, I'm not really a neutral observer of the context. But maybe I can just kind of sketch out, a brief history of the past few decades to give people a sense of how we ended up with the largest land invasion in Europe that's happened since the Second World War. I realize I'm like talking to an audience and I'm always like looking for the audience and waiting for people to nod, but I actually can't see anybody because we're on Zoom. So I'll just keep talking to Karen. Um, okay, so I'm going to assume that this is an audience of people who are, of an age where a lot of you might remember the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Um, the Soviet Union was the largest social engineering experiment ever performed in human history. Nobody had ever on that scale, try to remake not just a government or a political system and not just a society, but human beings, to try to remake human beings. And it seemed that it would last forever until the moment when it fell apart. And when it fell apart, first in 1989, with the coming down of the Berlin Wall, where communism fell in the East European Communist Bloc, which was not formally part of the Soviet Union, and then in 1991, where the Soviet Union itself actually broke up. And the Soviet Union, which is just this enormous country, spanning both Europe and Asia, was composed of 15 constituent republics. So a little bit like states, there were some things that were decided on, a central level in Moscow, and there were other things that were decided at the republic level. These republics kind of, there were many of them, they ran all the way through, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, up through the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Belarus and Ukraine, which is the part of the Soviet Empire. So Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, that is sort of most relevant for today's story. And to say a few words about those states, the Soviet Union was, it was, as I said, it was a radical social engineering experiment. It was a project of Bolshevism, which is a whole other story. It, took place on lands consolidated largely from the former Russian Empire, what had been the Russian Empire. Now, with all of these big pre-modern empires, there were border shifting many times, through wars with neighboring empires over hundreds of years. The borders were, had been blurry in many places for a very long time. And these were deeply multilingual places, which is another important thing to keep in mind. So one of the things about Ukraine that I'll just note at the beginning is, this is a part of the world that had long been deeply multilingual. To a large extent, it was only nation building in the 19th century that gave people the idea that each nation should have its own language and maybe they should only speak one, because previously the de facto state of affairs was that people spoke lots of languages. Even illiterate peasants spoke lots of languages. And these were very kind of ethnically and multilingual, ethnically diverse and multilingual places. The legacy of that is that Ukraine to this day is a bilingual country in Ukrainian and Russian. As a generalization, as you move west, Ukrainian is more dominant, and as you move east, Russian is more dominant, but that obscures the fact that basically everybody can switch back and forth. And the relationship between Russian and Ukrainian is quite a bit like the relationship between, say, Spanish and Italian or Spanish and French. So distinct languages, but related from the same language family. So if you're a native Spanish speaker, you would have a big advantage in learning French or learning Italian. And certainly if you grow up with both those languages, it's something you could easily switch back and forth from. Okay, so Ukraine is bilingual. When the Soviet Union breaks up in 1991, these 15 constituent republics kind of de facto get their independence in various ways. You know, some of them are more determined to, some of them are just kind of handed to them, some of them aren't sure what's going on, but the Soviet Union breaks up. Russia, which is the largest constituent republic, gets the rights of being a successor state to the Soviet Union, which is a mixed blessing to say the least, but it does, and it's by far the largest. And Russian had been the imperial language of the Soviet Union. It had been the lingua franca that everybody used in all these different republics. You know, and these other former republics are kind of left to struggle on their own. Nobody knew how you transition from, you know, being a communist totalitarian country, you know, into being something else. It was a big question mark. There was a lot of somewhat, you know, smug, self-satisfied, also very cheerful, liberal Western self-confidence that the Wicked Witch is dead. And now we all just, you know, inevitably, exorably like ride the train of history to liberal democracy, in which liberalism, democracy, and a free market economy are all part of one utopian package. And you open the free market and basically everything will kind of naturally work out the way it's supposed to work out. Now, there had been, you know, many moments in the past 30 years to cause us to doubt that. This is the decisive moment of the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's thesis that, you know, that now history is over, which he, you know, announces in the early 1990s, that now we are all liberal democracy is the telos of history. Now we see this is where everyone was always going, you know, and the Wicked Witch is dead. This is the moment at which we all acknowledge that that did not work. That was a failure. That was a misunderstanding. The free market did not magically resolve all sorts of problems. It did not turn totalitarian countries magically into liberal democracies with human rights guarantees by any means. So in 1991, Ukraine was kind of handed its independence, not having fought for it, but having been given it like the other republics. Arguably didn't have any more of a plan in place than anybody else did. What follows, and not only in Ukraine, but in, you know, basically all of these post-Soviet republics in various ways, you know, is a lot of chaos, is sudden, you know, rapid increases in social and economic inequality, drastic inflation, corruption through transition, as property and state enterprises that had been nationalized are turned over to private hands, which often means that the handful of people who were in positions of power under the communist regime also become the most draconian capitalist. You have what was called a blackmail state to a large extent. There was corruption, there was oligarchy. There was a generation that continued to be basically, you know, communist apparatchiks suddenly, you know, recreating themselves as, you know, free market capitalists. And Ukraine kind of languished in this situation like a lot of other countries, basically until 2004. And at that point, there was an election between two victors, Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. And the very short version of that is that Viktor Yanukovych was your kind of post-Soviet gangster guy. And literally a gangster. I mean, he like starts out as a gangster. He's, you know, he's a criminal from the far east of the country. He's, you know, in prison a couple times. You know, he steals things. You know, they beat people up. He doesn't even really pretend not to be a gangster. And he's close to the Kremlin, which is also kind of run by, you know, gangsters. Gangsters turned oligarchs. The other Viktor Yushchenko, appeared to be the guy who was facing westward, who was looking towards European integration, who was interested in getting closer to the West, who was talking about democracy, you know, and human rights and things that lots of people, especially a young generation, really wanted. The short version of that story is that in those 2004 elections, as a result of widespread and ostentatious election fraud and an attempt to poison Yushchenko with dioxin, Yanukovych was declared the winner. At that point, Ukrainians went out onto the streets. In particular, they went out onto the large square called the Maidan in the center of Kiev. And in that square, they protested. And basically, they protested for free elections. They were demanding free and fair elections. There was no violence. Nothing terrible happened, although they did freeze out there in November for 3 weeks. And in the end, they won. The elections were done over. Yushchenko was declared the winner, and everyone was happy and went home. And then the short version of that story is that it turned out not to work out so well. It wasn't the happily ever after people had thought. Yushchenko was not, the savior leading Ukraine into the Western Promised Land that they had hoped. There was a lot of infighting on his staff, whether because he was never exactly who they thought he was, or too much pressure on one person, or he was never the same after the dioxin poisoning. For whatever reason, he turns out to be a huge disappointment. And at that point, nobody would have ever thought that Yanukovych could come back. He was so thoroughly discredited. Not only did he lose the election, but it was acknowledged that there was widespread election fraud, and that his team had poisoned Yushchenko with dioxin, not managing to kill him, but managing to disfigure his face grotesquely enough that it became an emblem of post-communist corruption. But Yanukovych in the background starts plotting a return, which again seems impossible. But he hires a really slick PR guy from Washington who has a little boutique industry going, which is basically PR for gangsters with presidential ambitions, which it turns out we have. And that PR agent, whose name was Paul Manafort, who doesn't know Russian, doesn't know Ukrainian, flies over to Kiev and starts playing golf with Yanukovych and giving him a makeover, and working on the clothes and the hair and the media appearances, and there's so much disappointment with Yushchenko, and Manafort manages to pull so many strings in various places that in 2010 Yanukovych comes back and this time legitimately wins the presidential election. At that point, lots of people, who are not happy with the situation, like my friends and colleagues, get very depressed. But the carrot that Yanukovych is holding out to the opposition is that despite everything, he is nominally leading the country towards a course of European integration, that there are gestures in that direction. And the big question for Eastern Europe, and the whole communist bloc, including former Soviet states after 1989, is Europe going to accept them? Are they going to be able to become members of the European Union? Are they going to be able to become members of NATO? Both do they want to, which is generally fairly obvious, and is Europe going to let them in? Is Europe ever going to think of them as European countries? And so Yanukovych is kind of nominally, making some vague flirtations in the direction of the EU. In 2013, there is a long anticipated association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union that is due to be signed. It's taken a long time to negotiate. It's all ready. There's a signing ceremony in Vilnius. The pens are laid out. The association agreement is not great. It would have involved Ukraine taking on costly reforms. It would have provoked retaliation from the Kremlin because, Putin's idea was that he's not going to let anyone go towards Europe. He's going to maintain his control over his sphere of influence. And at the end of the day, that association agreement did not promise any EU membership if Ukraine did everything right. Nevertheless, it was symbolically of enormous significance. It was a foot in the door. It was a sign that, Ukraine had an intention of aligning with European standards, of eliminating corruption, or at least cutting down of corruption, of instituting the rule of law, of moving towards, EU standards, whatever those may be, of respecting human rights, of, no longer assassinating dissident journalists, say. So Ukraine had an intention of moving in that direction, and a sign that Europe, at least provisionally and contingently, was open to the possibility of receiving Ukraine. So this was huge. November 21st, 2013, at the 11th hour, Yanukovych, after talking with Putin, suddenly says, no, I'm not going to sign. At that point, people are devastated, especially young people. For teenagers, for university students, for people starting out their career, whether or not Europe would be open to them meant everything. You know, it was their future. And there was a feeling that suddenly their future was just snatched out of their hands, that it was over before it had started. And still nothing might have happened had not a 32-year-old Afghan Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Naim posted that day, November 21st, 2013, on Facebook in Russian, a short note saying, you know, hey guys, let's be serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan, that central square in the center of Kiev, by midnight tonight. And then he said, likes do not count. And as a historian, I really paused on that sentence because I thought, well, likes do not count. That's a sentence that would have made no sense before Facebook. It would have been literally made no sense. And now here it is, it's going to instigate a revolution in the 21st century. People come out, they come out that night, hundreds of people, largely, but not exclusively, young people, students, people say between the ages of like 18 and 28. They're completely peaceful, they're nonviolent, they play music, they hold hands, they sing. They're not interested in ethnic politics, they're not interested in religion, they're not interested in language politics, they're not interested in which language they're speaking. Their slogan is Ukraine is Europe. That's it. They want Europe to be open to them. Ukraine is Europe. They stay there and freeze again for about 9 days until Yanukovych decides to crack down on the protest. Anywhere from several thousand to several hundred to a couple thousand people. And around 4 in the morning on November 30th, he sends his riot police to brutally beat up the students. And at that point, it's a shock because even though there had been, it was a brutal regime, dissident journalists were, getting assassinated here and there. But there had been some unspoken social contract that it was a regime that did not use mass violence against its own citizens. That had not happened since 1991. And so it was a violation of an unspoken social contract. Nobody was actually killed, although it was close in some cases, but the brutality was enough that it seems Yanukovych was counting on the parents to pull their kids off the streets. And that was where he miscalculated, because instead of pulling their kids off the streets, the parents joined them there. A day and a half later, you went from having 2,000 people on the Maidan to suddenly there are close to 1 million people in the streets of Kiev. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev. And now they're no longer just shouting, Ukraine is Europe. Now the slogan is, we will not permit them to beat our children. And something that had been called Euromaidan then just became Maidan, the name of the square. And it was understood as, an impassioned revolt, against a regime's violence towards its own people, against being treated as things and not human beings, against an absence of human rights and any kind of respect for human dignity. It became something about a revolution that was about something much larger than just EU membership, which was something that had mattered very much to a smaller number of people for whom that upward mobility would have been tremendously significant. What happened next, nobody had expected. The Maidan, which is a very large square and it's a complex geographical space, became a whole parallel alternative world. For those of you who are old enough to remember this, you might think a little bit of the parking lot at a Grateful Dead concert. Like there's a whole parallel world going, except it was not quite so hippie-ish. By that point, it became very serious. But there were large kitchens operating day and night. There were medical points. Doctors were volunteering because people who were injured were often kidnapped from hospitals by Yanukovych's police. So people were treated on the Maidan by doctors who volunteered at medical points. There were concerts on the Maidan. There was a stage. There was an open university. There were film screenings. There was clothing distribution. There were cleanup crews. It was a whole, there were tents set up. People were living there. People were spending day and night there. It was a whole parallel world. And it became an extraordinarily sophisticated parallel society, with a very sophisticated infrastructure. Dissidents had called this in the 70s and 80s a parallel polis. And it was a place where people were living, as if they were free. There was no alcohol on the Maidan. There was a sense of collective responsibility. There were infrastructural units that kind of came up miraculously overnight. People were getting kidnapped, people were getting taken away and tortured and their bodies left in the woods. Emergency hotline was set up. There was a whole network of people who had cars who were also kind of running emergency rescue services. I asked one of my friends, Katya, who I was in Vienna at the time, who was shuttling back and forth between Kiev and Vienna at the time. And I said, Katya, how did you guys get like a hotline set up overnight? And she said, oh, there was an LGBT group that had like a modest confidential hotline, for people to call and have confidential conversations when they were thinking about and wanting to talk about, their sexuality. And it was a project, and it was a small scale project. But it turns out that you have these small scale projects, and those little nascent pieces of infrastructure can then explode overnight. So you have a hotline set up, it might be limited, it might be modest scale, but you've got something set up, and then suddenly all these little instances of civil society that had been kind of brewing latently beneath the surface then kind of exploded. And it was an extraordinary, that Maidan live streamed itself 24 hours a day. You could literally watch it all be live streamed. Yanukovych and Putin were controlling the official media, but the Maidan was winning in the social media. It's a revolution that would have been impossible before the internet. It was all organized. It was all organized over the internet. And people changed during those months on the Maidan. When those students went out there on November 21st, nobody was thinking, are we willing to die here? And by the second half of January, you could feel it, like almost tangibly. I mean, you could feel that a critical mass of people had reached a decision and they were willing to die there if need be. And it was a kind of beautiful and extraordinary and terrifying thing to watch, because the feeling was stronger and stronger that it was going to end in violence, that those people were not going to leave, that they had staked their lives on this, and that Putin was not going to let Yanukovych give up, and Yanukovych wasn't going to give up. And Yanukovych was the kind of person for whom the lives of other people didn't mean anything in any case. It culminates in a sniper massacre by Yanukovych's people in February 2014. Over 100 people are killed, many, if not most of them, by snipers. On top of high rises on that square. There is the Polish foreign minister at the time, Radek Sikorski, flies over in the midst of the shooting to attempt to negotiate a ceasefire with Yanukovych, which is tentatively successful, and that's a whole other story. But people on the Maidan they accept it reluctantly. They've just seen their people massacred. The ceasefire agreement is that Yanukovych will remain president until further elections several months from now will occur. But there was such fury against him. And Yanukovych is never a particularly impressive figure, that within 48 hours after that ceasefire, in the end of February 2014, Yanukovych flees across the border into Russia and is given refuge by Putin. So now the Maidan has won, but there's no real government in place. One government has just fallen, and another government has yet to be put in place. Putin decides to use this moment to send over soldiers in unmarked camouflage to illegally annex the Crimean Peninsula, which is part of, which was part of the the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was now part of independent Ukraine, and Putin just takes it, and he takes it at a moment where Ukraine could not possibly have been prepared to defend it because they've just deposed one president. And they don't really have a functioning government or a functioning army at the time. So he sends in his so-called little green men in unmarked camouflage to take the Crimea, which he does in a grotesque violation of international law, but without bloodshed. You know, they never really have a choice, although it continues not to be recognized. More gruesomely, he starts to instigate separatist rebellions in the east of Ukraine. So the Kremlin starts to disseminate the story that the revolution on the Maidan was a CIA-sponsored Ukrainian fascist conspiracy, that Ukrainian Nazis, far-right nationalists, are now heading east from Kiev to commit genocide of all the native Russian speakers who dominate in the east. Now, this was a fantasy. It came out of Putin's head. There was never any evidence for this. But many people did believe it, or I should say, especially the closer you got, into kind of post-industrial, post-Soviet, more remote regions of the East, more people listening to Russian television believed the story that people were coming to massacre them. Putin then tried to kind of send various agents, or what were so-called Russian tourists, mercenaries, paid thugs across the border to encourage local separatists to rise up, overthrow local governments, and institute separatist republics. It was unclear in the spring of 2014 where this would work, where it wouldn't work. Putin was hoping for, a big chunk of Ukraine east of Kiev. It fails in Odessa, it fails in Kharkiv, fails in Dnipropetrovsk. These are all large and overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, Russian-dominant cities, fails everywhere, except for this small post-industrial mining region of the Donbass, where separatist revolts take off in a handful of small cities. It's kind of unclear in the beginning exactly what's going on. There's a kind of mixture of random local gangsters, Russian nationalists, soccer fans who have been paid, Kremlin agents, Russian soldiers who aren't sure exactly what they're doing there, in a kind of postmodern mishmash. It's that war that Kremlin instigated in the Donbass resulted in two tiny dysfunctional so-called separatist republics, the Luhansk National Republic and the Donetsk National Republic, in a war that has been simmering now for 8 years. And it's resulted in some 15,000 deaths before this invasion, as well as 1.5 million internally displaced people. So people from the Donbass who became refugees in their own country, who abandoned their homes and abandoned their jobs, fleeing from the war. What kept haunting me about the Donbass is as a historian, I kept thinking about the Munich conference in September 1938 and Hitler's illegal annexation of the Sudetenland and how the West kind of lets him get away with it in order to avoid the war. And Neville Chamberlain, after his appeasement at Munich, comes back and tells the British people, I have brought you peace in our time, and how horrible that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks on behalf of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And watching the Donbass in 2014 and watching this annexation of Crimea and being a historian of Europe, I thought, my God, the Donbass is that site of the quarrel in the faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. This place that seems forgotten, out of the way, no one's ever been there, who doesn't live there, and that could be that could very well be the place where the Third World War begins. So that has been simmering for 8 years. In 2014, when it starts, Ukraine was in no position to defend itself. The army was being crowdfunded on the internet. It took some time to get new presidential elections together. Basically, everything was done by civil society. I mean, there were people being there were Ukrainians or people on the Ukrainian side being regularly taken captive and tortured by separatists in basements. The prisoner exchanges were being negotiated largely by civil society groups. A physicist, an environmentalist engineer who worked on, clean energy, started devoting himself to organizing civil society groups to facilitate prisoner exchanges, because basically the state wasn't functioning yet, and the army was being crowdsourced on the internet. Now, in the course of the past 8 years, a lot has changed. The war has continued to simmer, but a new generation of activists and of young people who were active in the Maidan, or who were graduate students during the Maidan, or young IT people or engineers, have gone into public service. And kind of quietly, in the background, Ukraine has gotten an army together. They have a new cadres of people with language skills, working in foreign policy. Some of these people are graduate students that, I had been working on dissertations with, or the graduate students of my colleagues, who I had been at conferences with, who in some other world might have ended up at the university, but, have decided to go into public service. So when Putin started amassing troops on the border, from the point of view of the Ukrainians, if they didn't seem so alarmed, it was because from their point of view, they've been at war with Russia for the past 8 years. And you might remember that it was Russian weapons that shot down the Malaysian Airlines flight 8 years ago, and 300 people were just dead for no reason. So for them, it was kind of more continuity than a break. Nobody knew whether or not Putin was going to invade. He was amassing troops on the border. He started sounding more and more crazy. Certainly the speech he gave on February 21st, he sounded unhinged in a way that I think 8 years ago, he sounded like the shrewd grand strategist, master chess player, who is easily capable of lying and lied regularly. Now in February 21st, talking about how, okay, I'll show you Ukrainians what decommunization means, I'll wipe you off the map. He sounded unhinged, like a character in a Shakespearean drama, an aging man facing his own mortality who had decided to blow up the world. The current president of Ukraine, who is a comedian in his mid-40s, who is a Jew, most of whose family of previous generations perished in the Holocaust. He's a native Russian speaker whose Russian is stronger than his Ukrainian. And he represents a new generation, of people coming into state service who kind of came of age entirely in post-Soviet Ukraine, as opposed to a generation of people in power in Russia who are figures who kind of came of age and were trained still during the Soviet period. I was an agnostic about Zelensky before this. He has extraordinarily risen to the occasion. I just want to mention one more thing before I stop talking. On the night of February 23rd, hours before Putin invaded, Zelensky gave an address in Russian, not to Putin and not to Ukrainians, but to Russian people. And it was one of the most moving political addresses I've ever heard anywhere. And he said, don't do this. Don't come and invade our country. You have no reason to. Many people are going to die for nothing. We're not your enemies. This is not a fascist regime. Putin is claiming that we have a Nazi regime here and he needs to come denazify Ukraine. That's not true. Don't come and kill us. We don't want to fight you. If you come, we will defend ourselves. If you come, we will not lay down arms. We will not run away. You will not see our backs. You will see our faces. We will look you in the eye. But that's not what we want. We don't want to fight. And several hours later, Putin launched this totally unprovoked, grotesque attack and just started bombing the country. The Ukrainians were totally outmatched in terms of numbers of troops and equipment and resources. Western military analysts were saying that, Kiev will fall in a day or two. They have no chance. extraordinarily, they've now held out for 6 weeks. I'm not a military expert. By all accounts, the Ukrainian military has been fighting much, much better than the Russian military, despite having fewer people and much less equipment. Although now people are sending more and more equipment. Behind the scenes for the past 8 years, they've gotten some extremely competent and skilled people, preparing on both for hybrid warfare, preparing for information warfare, preparing for training new cadres and a new generation of potential soldiers. But what is happening that is so grotesque is that while Ukrainian soldiers are winning quite clearly on the actual battlefield, and there's a good number of Russian soldiers, although not enough, who are surrendering, who are defecting, who are laying down their arms, who are running away, who don't understand why they're there in the first place. Putin is just using moral blackmail, and he is committing mass atrocities against civilians. He is carpet bombing whole cities. There are children dying slowly, buried under rubble in Mariupol. People are dying of thirst. They're dying of hunger. He has reduced cities to rubble. He has been mass bombing hospitals, preschools, schools, residential buildings. And in smaller towns, executing all the men, tying people's hands behind their back. In the past couple days, since the Ukrainians have taken back some of these suburbs of Kiev, there have just been gruesome mass graves discovered, including mutilated women's bodies with genitals mutilated, with torture marks, with people thrown in ditches. Just this total grotesque breakdown of any kind of civilization whatsoever. That is just, when you thought nothing could be shocking, is actually very shocking. Massive human rights abuses. Everyone is saying, he will be taken to the court. The UN is condemning this. We have, human rights teams there documenting this. But what this is all laid bare is that the international community has no coercive power, and the UN can pass one resolution after another, and the International Court at The Hague can pass one resolution after another, but nobody actually has any coercive power after Putin, and nobody has actually managed to get that man out of power. And the only reasons for that war that anybody knows are going on inside his head. Okay, I'll stop talking there. I hope that story made somewhat sense. I know it was very brief, and I'm happy to try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Professor Shore. Lots of great information. Certainly a lot of information that did not filter through to me in particular as a person. We're bombarded with a lot of news, but not particularly anything in depth, especially about Maidan, et cetera. So I really appreciate you giving us that context. So now I invite people to either unmute themselves, ask questions. You can put questions or comments in the chat as well, which I will share. To get us started, Lauren put in the chat a question. Someone told Lauren that when NATO was formed, it was quote unquote agreed that they would never add countries that border on Russia. Is that true? There
have been different stages in the history of NATO, and with the debate that the political scientists are having now is, should NATO have expanded? So NATO was a defense organization formed after the Second World War in response to the Warsaw Pact, which was a defense organization formed, by the Soviet bloc. So think back to 1947, 1948, early 1950s, as the Cold War was consolidating the sides. So the Soviet Union, had, got its own defense organization by which it also kind of claimed dominance over Eastern Europe. You might remember Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta and the Spheres of Influence Agreement. And then in response, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed by, the Western non-communist powers. Now, you could argue that, after 1991, it no longer had any kind of reason for existence. And there were lots of debates about that. Should the EU expand, after 1991? Should NATO expand? And that was a debate that lots of defense experts and political scientists were having, and it was not something I admittedly followed very closely. But in fact, it did expand. And I think in 2003, the 3 Baltic states that had been former Soviet were admitted. So not only these countries of Eastern Europe that had been communist but not Soviet, but also Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And basically, it's a kind of guarantee under Article 5 that, an attack on one is an attack on all. But it generally hasn't done much. It's been of more symbolic significance. And at various moments, there were attempts to negotiate or to promise officially, unofficially, that it would not expand closer to Russia's border. Because there was a sense of, that there's certainly a sense Putin had that this should be my sphere of influence. That this was, and that the expansion of NATO is a threat from the point of view of NATO, like we never have had any intention or even suggestion that we would attack Russia. The reason why these little Baltic states, which are small, want to be part of NATO at all is because they're afraid Russia's going to attack them. So now there's a big debate happening, like, if NATO had not expanded in 2003, as at various moments it seemed like there'd be promises it wouldn't, is that the thing that's provoked Putin? Was Putin going to be provoked regardless? Is it the fact that Ukraine, would have liked to join NATO precisely because they don't want to be left alone during an attack like this? Like if, Biden keeps saying, like, if they go 1 foot into NATO territory, we will defend NATO territory. That's our treaty obligation, whereas Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so they've been left to fight alone. I don't find it the most productive debate at the moment. Should NATO have expanded 20 years ago? Should they not have expanded 20 years ago? Should NATO have let Ukraine in? Should they not have let Ukraine in? Should Ukraine not have even tried to provoke Putin by suggesting it might be part of NATO? If NATO didn't exist, would, Putin still be so edgy? I think it still comes back to, we're all kind of prisoner to what is going on in the mind of one man, and none of us have any privileged epistemological access to that.
Thank you. We have a thank you from Karen for this detailed history. She notes you clearly debunked the role of the CIA in the 2013 uprising. She's interested in what role you've seen the US play in the Ukrainian-Russian relationship.
Okay, so this is interesting. So one of the sad paradoxes to me is that, as somebody who was watching the Maidan very carefully, and I wrote a book about the Maidan called The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, which, by the way, a publishers consortium, in solidarity with Ukraine, has now made for until mid-April, I think, available for free online, along with a bunch of other books about Ukraine. So you can, I can send Karen that link, and you're all welcome to read it. Wait, sorry, what was I forgot what the question was. I was answering
the role of the United States in the Ukraine.
Oh yes, okay. So what when Putin said, as the Maidan culminated in this massacre and he tried to instigate this rebellion, the Maidan was a CIA-sponsored conspiracy, and now these Ukrainian Nazis are coming. Not only was I aware that it was not a far right-wing nationalist movement, and not only was I aware that it was not America who instigated it, but I was painfully aware that for my friends who were getting shot at on the Maidan, they were desperately hoping from some kind of solidarity from the United States, from the West. And basically everyone's attention was elsewhere. Victoria Nuland was there, and she handed out some sandwiches, and she said some words of support, and our Senator Chris Murphy came and said some words of support, but it was symbolic support. Not only were we not engineering it, we weren't really doing anything. And people weren't paying that much attention, and Europe wasn't paying that much attention. And the Germans were worried about upsetting Putin. So it's very different this time. This time Biden has really been on it. It was one of the things American intelligence did, and one of the things I think the whole world has gotten savvier about. In 2013, 2014, Putin was using this kind of postmodernist post-truth. I'll disseminate via internet trolls one story here, another story there, and a third story over there, so nobody really knows what's real, and everyone throws up their arms, and gives up even trying. When Trump came on the scene here, if I understood sooner than most of my American colleagues what was going on, it was only because I had been watching Russia and Ukraine, and I understood what this post-truth thing was about. Trump came on the scene, and American journalists were initially taken off guard. They were used to fact-checking individual pieces of information. They were not used to a total unhinging from empirical reality. But in the past years and through the Trump administration, people have gotten much savvier about post-truth and the unhinging from empirical reality. They've gotten much savvier about this politics of provocation, where you plant various stories and, have some, set up someone to, like to do something bad to your side, to then create a pretext for you to do bad things to other people. And the intelligence that the Biden administration was gathering leading up to this invasion, one of the things they were doing, which was very atypical, was not only were they gathering very good intelligence on Putin's intention, but they were immediately publicizing it. They were immediately publicizing it to make it impossible for Putin using provocation to create some false pretext of the invasion, because they kept telling everybody what was going on. So there's been much more solidarity. There's been much more understanding. I mean, I think generally people understand what's going on. It's a totally unprovoked invasion, by an army committing mass atrocities against civilians for absolutely no reason, or for a reason that only exists in the mind of one man. From the point of view of the Ukrainians, like, this would be an unprecedented amount of solidarity, but it's not enough. They're fighting alone. People are, with the West, and not only Biden, but, other have been putting sanctions on Russia, unprecedented sanctions. It's still not enough. It's not like, the Russians are still getting too much money from oil and gas, and that's allowing them to continue the war. And people are sending weapons, more than I think have ever been sent before, but it's still not enough. And the Ukrainians are still fighting alone.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions in the chat. I'll give you one more in light of the time. Christina asked, could you say a few words about claims of reviving an ancient, old Russia that includes geographic areas like Ukraine? Where did this come from historically? Is it fake / post-truth / propaganda, like the Ukraine equals Nazi story, or is there some outdated, all-powerful Russia Putin is trying to revive? Another part of the question is Putin's madness to justify his revenge for the last 10 years of revolt in Ukraine.
Okay, that's a very good question. So first of all, let me say that these empires and these borders have shifted many, many times, over hundreds of years. Like, for instance, there's a joke that historians like to tell about the town of, which is not really a joke, but it's an illustrative anecdote about the town of Uzhgorod, which is in southwestern Ukraine. And the joke has a child going to his grandfather and saying, well, where have you lived, grandfather? And he says, well, I was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then I spent about 20 years in Czechoslovakia. During the Second World War, I was in Hungary. After the war, I lived in the Soviet Union. And now in my old age, I'm living in Ukraine. And the child says, grandfather, you've moved so many times. And the grandfather says, not at all. I've spent my whole life right here in Uzhgorod. So these are places where the borders have shifted many, many times. Lviv had been, a city, and it had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was part of the Austrian Empire, then was part of interwar Poland, that was taken, then it was part of Soviet Ukraine, then it was, then it was under Nazi rule, so all of these borders have shifted many, many times. You could pick some random moment, you can say, 1666 or 1721, or like, let's restore the borders as of this place, as of this time. Basically, that's all kind of arbitrary. And what I tell people is, like, the closest analogy I can think of is, imagine that January 6th had gone the other way and we had a fascist coup in the States. And my personal opinion as a historian is that we were a hair's breadth away from that, and it could have easily gone the other way. So imagine we have a fascist regime here led by Trump. Trump decides that, like, hey, that border with Canada is very contingent. A few hundred years ago, it didn't exist. Maybe Canada is bilingual in French and English, but really they all speak English. And that should be like, we have lots of relatives over there. There are our people. Let's go show them who's boss. Let's go march on Canada. Suppose, like, the American army, now under a Trumpian fascist dictatorship, shows up in Toronto, starts carpet bombing the city and saying, hey, like, why isn't everyone happy to see us? I mean, aren't they, like, they seem just like us. The culture seems very familiar. They're also speaking English. Lots of people in Philadelphia have cousins in Toronto. There are lots of families on both sides of the border. Why wouldn't they want to live under our government? And then you start, people would say like, well, it's not a question of ethnicity or language. There's a different political culture there. They didn't choose this, fascist regime, and there's a culture of social democracy that's more, and that's basically like what it would be. I mean, the real difference, is not about language or not about ethnicity. The real difference is about political culture, especially as it's evolved in the past decades. They don't want to live, like the Ukrainians hadn't hated Russia before. Now they will. Now it will be 100 years of hatred that didn't exist before. They don't want to live under Putin's totalitarian dictatorship.
Thank you. We are going to stop there. It is a minute past 9. But I want to take an opportunity to thank you very much for this morning's talk. Very, very full of information, and I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions, which I'm happy to forward to you. My contact information is in the chat if anyone wants to follow up. This meeting will also has been recorded. We'll also post this on our YouTube channel. But thank you so much. It was really great to virtually meet you and learn more about your work. And thank you for this important opportunity to learn more about what's going on in Ukraine.
And thank you all for listening. And Karen, thank you so much for inviting me.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next month for our final breakfast of the academic year. Have a wonderful Monday and rest of your week. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shore.